Hello, freedom-loving people, and welcome to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. Glenn and I are very fortunate today to be joined by Peter Clement. Spent 40 plus years at the CIA as a Soviet Union and Russian analyst, PDB briefer, Deputy Assistant Director for Europe and Eurasia, which for those in the know is a very senior post, recipient of the CIA's Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, professor at Columbia University now, and has a book being published by the Cipher Brief on CIA analysts, title forthcoming. But Peter, thank you so much for joining. I understand you and Glenn know each other. You go way back. Can only imagine why. Would love to hear a little bit more about that. And then today, just for people listening, we're going to dig into post-Putin succession scenarios. Does Putin really face domestic pressure? And what's going on Russia and Ukraine at a very high level? But Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Well, Ryan and Glenn, thank you so much for having me on. I'm delighted to be here. It's always fun to talk about one of my favorite subjects. And I'm delighted to be here with Glenn in particular. And I'm going to turn it over to Glenn to let him tell you how we know each other.
Well, first of all, it's great to see you guys. One of the things that is very special about Peter, which you didn't mention, Ryan, but I have to mention it, is he is originally from Bellport, New York. Maybe the most important town in all of the U.S. Definitely the most beautiful beaches in the United States, and maybe in a lot of the beaches in the world. And a great little town. And so I also happen to be from Bellport. And let me just say this. When I retired from the agency in 2023, I was going through my stuff trying to downsize. And I went through a box I had of notes that I took when I worked for INSCOM for the Army. And I went through some training with the agency in 1989. I'm dating myself. This is during the last Cold War. And there was a syllabus, and the expert from CIA SOVA who came to speak to us about Soviet politics was Peter Clement.
Wow.
And I remember being in this class and like super amazed. By the way, I was a Russian literature and Soviet studies major in college, and I heard this expert come and speak to us, and I was like blown away by the knowledge. And then I realized years later, I can't say where I was, but I was in a station somewhere, and the chief of station called me in his office, and he says, "Hey, aren't you from Long Island?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I got to introduce you to this guy. He's visiting. He's our senior Russia expert, senior Russia analyst." And there was Peter Clement. And Peter said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Bellport." And he goes, "No way, I'm from Bellport." And we have that bond. Of course, we have the commonality in that we were very fascinated by Russia in our careers. We worked the issue for many years in different capacities. Peter was kind of a mentor and a inspiration. And I'm thrilled to have him on the program, because what we're going to talk about today, Russian internal politics and maybe the future of Russia. This comes up all the time. It's an issue I think probably people in Washington aren't thinking about enough. It's my own assessment based on what I saw in the early 1990s in Russia. I was just on another podcast and this came up, and I said, I think we flubbed it in the early 90s, and I can explain why. But Peter's going to talk about, and this is someone who's been studying this issue for many, many years. And now he's a professor, as you mentioned, at Columbia. And so he's still very active in the foreign policy world and Russian studies world. And it's great to have you on, Peter. And Ryan, thank you for setting this up.
Can't wait.
Thank you, Glenn. I need to return the favor here. I got to know Glenn much later in my career, and I was stunned to find out we went to the same high school. I couldn't even believe it. And as I got to know Glenn and I've had him come speak to my classes at Columbia, I mean, I'm in awe of you, Glenn. You have served in so many places. Your language skills are amazing, and you're a serious Russia guy. We're not going to use the word expert, because I think we both agree, hard to be an expert about Russia. And as you say, I'm not sure the Russians understand themselves, but it's a country of such intrigue and fascination that I know how we both got into this business. It's really hard not to want to learn more about Russia.
Amen.
Peter, why don't we jump in? I mean, people who listen to this program, they follow what's going on in the headlines for sure, probably go a little bit deeper, but it really does look at Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, and other hotspots in the globe. I love your suggestion. Let's talk post-Putin succession planning. What does that look like? How do you think about this? And I should have done a better job in the intro. You're a career analyst. Like, you have done this your whole career, analyzing states, leaders, programs, militaries, et cetera. So I'm just very interested to hear, what does the future look like from your lens?
Thanks so much, Ryan. When I went to graduate school, I studied politics of the Soviet Union under Stalin in the 1930s. And I have to tell you, I learned a lot from that because I think there are so many interesting parallels with the Russia that Mr. Putin has created in terms of the massive control of all sources of media, the way he deals with political enemies. We're not at the same level. We don't have a gulag that I know of, but this is a pretty harsh regime. And I do see a lot of parallels, and also the political maneuvering among some of the people in the elites, some of whom fall out of the club because they made a grievous mistake about getting too interested in politics, things like that. There's so many interesting parallels. So I have been doing this for a long time, and I still enjoy doing it. The thing I'd like to talk about today is the succession process. Most people probably know Mr. Putin is now 73 years old. He'll be 74 in October. And some people like to say, boy, they're in their 70s. I don't like to say that a whole lot because it's getting a little too dicey for me. But, people generally start to say, oh my gosh. I must tell one anecdote. I can't resist. I was at a briefing with a director at the agency. We had a team of analysts brief the director on a foreign head of state. And this guy was in big trouble. Politically, there were problems. He was looking unstable, but he had health issues. So the analyst said, oh, well, Mr. Director, he's got these health issues. He's got a lot of political woes. And, he's like 70.
No.
And the director was 74. Was all I could do. I've told this story to my students. The message is be mindful of your audience, know how old they are, and choose words appropriately.
Great lesson.
And they did a great briefing. I said, you did a great job, but in the future, think a little bit about your audience more. Anyway, in Putin's case, people do look at his age, and there were these periodic stories about health issues. I wish I knew a lot more about that subject. I don't. Maybe, Glenn, you've got some thoughts on his health. But at some point, Putin's mortal. He will leave the scene. So Kim Martin, a colleague of mine at Barnard in Columbia, we teamed up to write a journal article on the succession process, and we focused on scenarios. How exactly would Putin leave the scene, and how might a succession process play out? So we came up basically with 4, I think, pretty standard kinds of possible scenarios. So the first is Putin steps back and decides it's time to do the handoff, and he manages a succession process on his own. And Glenn, we can debate some of these points after. Let me walk through them, but you can have good debates about all these. So that's one. The second one is Putin dies in office. That's a biggie. The third, Putin is ousted by an internal coup. And there's 2 variants. There's a soft coup. Think Khrushchev in 1964. They didn't execute him. They let him go live on a farm and live out his life. Then there's a hard coup where you might need the security and military folks to push the guy out of office, not necessarily kill him. Think 1991, Gorbachev was in fact the victim of a failed, abortive, hard coup. So there's different kinds of coups. But anyway, somehow internally, somebody removes the president. Then the fourth scenario is there's a massive revolt, large protests, an uprising. Not sure I would call it a revolution per se, but, enough to bring the regime down, and the entire regime falls along with Putin.
Yeah, Peter, one thing I would say is Russians, if they hear this, and I'm sure somebody will hear this podcast, and they hear former CIA officers talking about change of regime in Russia, immediately in their paranoid world, they go to there's plotting going on to remove Putin, right? I mean, that was my experience. I think all 4 scenarios there's possibility of all 4, and yeah, we could go through each one. There are different factors that play into each, and probably nuance in each, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yes, Putin, although this is just my assessment, I think Putin has come to the conclusion that he's the only person that can run Russia.
Yes.
And he's the only person smart enough and capable enough to manage the country. He brought it out of chaos, and he's bringing it to greatness again, although we could argue that is not working since 2014. But I'm not sure he believes that, and I'm not sure that people around him actually tell him the truth about how bad things are getting. So that's a whole other issue. But I think, I came to this conclusion maybe 10 years ago. He just is convinced that he's the only person that can manage and successfully run Russia. And he has to live as long as possible to realize his dream of making Russia great again.
I absolutely agree with you on this point. Absolutely. So I would rule out scenario number 1. I do not think he's going to try to manage a succession process. Moreover, if you look back on other regimes or in Russian history, stepping aside, in his case in particular, there were a lot of people who don't necessarily like him a lot. Could you be assured of a happy, restful retirement in some nice place with all the perks?
Right.
Maybe, but there's some people who might not want him to be so happy in retirement.
I would add to that especially after this horrendous war and the consequences that it's had for a lot of Russians. If I were Putin, I would not think about going to retire in the Crimea or retire in in Sochi, because I'm sure there are a lot of people that are going to be looking for him, including angry Russians whose children he sent off, or who they themselves were sent off to fight this war. So
for all those reasons and probably more, that's a really good argument for why I don't think he can have a happy, secure, voluntary retirement.
Right.
So in the second scenario, and this is one of the ones I find most intriguing, if Putin dies. And so immediately we discussed with a lot of our colleagues this whole issue. And my main argument was, well, this scenario totally depends on how he dies. Does he have a heart attack tonight and all of a sudden tomorrow we're in succession? Or does he, over time, he's got Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or dementia, and only the people really, really close and around him on a regular basis know this big secret. In the first scenario, if he dies, there's a constitution. It does say the prime minister becomes acting. In 90 days, you have an election. Maybe that's how it plays out. Although even there, I would argue, if some of the people in the inner circle around Putin may have thoughts about who the right person is who should be prime minister. We can discuss that later, but I think there's a little flexibility in that scenario. It doesn't automatically go to Prime Minister Mishustin is there and he's president. The other one, though, in the prolonged illness category, this is the one I find fascinating, because you can just imagine the maneuvering among all the players around him and the so-called inner circle actors. You've got the head of the services, you've got the FSB chief, the SVR chief, you've got oligarchs, financial and business types like Igor Sechin. There's people who are ideologically very, very close to him. And here Kovalchuk would be one. And I will avoid going to too many of the minutiae of these players, but there are people around him who may have their own agendas and they want to protect their equities and financial interests and so on. So they may have a voice. And so those who have direct access to Putin may try to influence him in his dotage here, if he's got health issues or mental issues, to convince him to do things they want him to do to get to the kind of succession they want. So it could revolve around who's the right person to be prime minister, for example. Mm-hmm. So I'm very intrigued by this, because if that's what happened, first of all, we might not know for a while that this process is underway, because they're not going to advertise he's got these health issues. And then when it does happen, that it can't be hidden anymore, it'll get very interesting, because then the succession becomes much more public and the maneuvering. Then you get the criminology part, trying to figure out who's who, who's closest, who said what and what it meant. And Glenn, I'm sure you've done a lot of this kind of criminological thinking yourself in the past.
Yeah, but usually when it's in relation to restricted handling podcast, trying to figure out what Ryan's thinking about his empire. No, do you, in this scenario, Peter, do you see like someone trying to play the role of Stalin with Lenin when he was laid up? He was sick. Stalin was the gatekeeper.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I mentioned that in the article. I mentioned Lenin's famous testament and the fact that it didn't quite get the circulation it needed, and that was stifled because Stalin had enough of his proteges in place by now that he was able to control the damage, primarily from Krupskaya, Lenin's wife. But that's a fascinating episode in Russian history. But yeah, I think that the other one that strikes me, the Stalin succession. So Stalin dies, and they knew he was not well, but it was a little bit sudden. Have you both seen the movie The Death of Stalin?
Yes. No, but I will. We'll put it in the show notes.
You must see this. Glenn, did you like it?
I liked it. It's a comedy.
It's satire.
It's satire. Honestly, anything to do with Stalin, I find it hard to find humor in, just because he was such a heinous individual.
Agreed.
But yeah, going back to the fight that happened, the struggle for power as he was dying, and how people, threw him under the bus. And you should watch the movie, Ryan. It is kind of funny. There are some very funny scenes and some great acting.
You've opened up a whole thing here. Two quick points. One, for those who don't know, when Stalin died, most of the people in the Politburo around him, then it was called the Presidium, they were terrified of one person, the head of the secret police, Beria, Lavrenti Beria. And so they found a means to get him arrested relatively quickly afterwards, and within months later, he was executed. The reason being, this guy he knew the info on everybody. He had files on everybody. So I wonder today, today in Putin's Russia, the FSB has a lot of information on a lot of people. So I wonder, to what extent that's a plus or a minus for whoever is head of the FSB, like currently Bortnikov, who has his own health issues, by the way. But that's something to think about too. And if there is, in fact, this maneuvering in a late Putin stage and then he dies.
Peter, what do you make of like there have been some younger people like the sons, like Petrushev's son, was brought in the position. Some people are claiming that he's preparing like the next generation to lead the country. Do you think that you put value in that, or do you think that this is just he's rewarding those guys by giving their children, like, it's like the boyars or whatever, the elite are getting.
It's basically patronage, right? It's for sinecures, because some of these young people, some are really talented and some less so talented from what I've read. I guess I'm less persuaded, but I'm open to it. I think it's more he's helping his close buddies take care of their families and so on. I don't know that there's a plan how we're going to bring the next generation of our guys in, but maybe I'm a little naive. It's a good question, though. So beyond the death scenario, we go to scenario number 3, and this is the one about the internal coup. And this one is also, I spent a lot of time thinking about this because I think a good case could be made. To do this, you really have to have somebody from the security services and probably the military supporting you, or at least not getting in your way if you're an internal plotter. And this is why the FSB thing is so important, because of all the info they do have. And they seem to be pretty hard-liner in their thinking, but there may be a lot. And Glenn, you said something earlier. There may be people who are really angry. Maybe they lost a loved one. Maybe they had a relative who died in this war. And so even among these guys, there's a little bit of resentment that, gosh, the boss just pushed this war way too long. We're in year 5 now. This is longer than the Soviet role in World War II. And the casualties are mounting. We're up to 1.5 casualties, 1.5 million. And I hear different estimates on deaths, but anywhere from 300, 400,000 deaths. Now, admittedly, they're not from the elite classes. I think that's probably correct. But if there's a new draft call or they have to get more bodies and they decide to go with some Russians, some of these people might start to get affected.
Peter, do you think the Prigozhin incident, would you have considered that a coup at the time, a coup attempt?
That's a great question. I didn't see it so much as a coup, as a message to Putin. You need to fix the way you're running your military, and you have the wrong people in charge. And the triggering event for the Prigozhin coup was when Putin finally sided with Gerasimov and the MOD people, Gorbachev, that they were going to formally make the Prigozhin people part of the military. They were going to have to sign up literally as a formal element of the military, and Prigozhin didn't want that, nor did probably a lot of his people. And so they were going to do something about it, and they started the march. I don't think it was to oust Putin, but Glenn, I'd welcome your thoughts on that. That's a big issue.
Well, I just say I'm on record. I wrote an article when that happened, and my own view is it was a setup. I think that they used Prigozhin to identify people that were disloyal to Putin.
Oh,
Some steam. It was a managed operation, and that probably Prigozhin mistakenly agreed to this because they told him, we'll let you do this and then there'll be no consequence. Like, we're not going to have you shot or trying to, for disobeying the commander in chief, the great leader. And of course, never make that deal in Russia because that guarantee isn't there. If you remember, I thought it was very odd. They said you can go to Belarus. He was going to go to Belarus. Now that's like going in exile from the U.S. to, I don't know, California. I mean, like, they're going to get you, right?
Yeah.
Lukashenko and his guys are not independent. And so, I maybe some people think I'm a conspiracy theorist on this, but I did probably look at the Russian stuff for too long. They love conspiracy theories, but I think that there was some angle here that is deeper than just Prigozhin being angry.
I'd have to think some more about that. The thing that stuck out most to me is Putin's televised comments at the very beginning. I was just struck that he seemed genuinely shocked and almost didn't know what to say. It was not his most articulate moment. So something in there wasn't right.
He probably did not have the backing of the military, like you just said, might be required. So what does a soft versus hard coup look like in your scenario?
The soft one would be if the inner circle in the health scenario, they realize he's got some time left, but he's not all there. They lean on him and say, hey, boss, it's time to retire. and we'll help you pick the new prime minister. And by the way, changing prime ministers is nothing new. In the last 3 years of Yeltsin's reign, from 96 to 99, there were 5 successive prime ministers. And I remember this vividly because at the time I was running the Russia office. And every time they named a new prime minister, we went bonkers because, oh my gosh, this could be the next president, because Yeltsin had a health issue. What if he dropped dead tomorrow? And he did have a heart attack in the middle of round 1 and round 2 in the 96 election. So naming the prime minister was a huge deal. So I'm thinking in this case, the guys around him, they understand that. So as I suggested earlier, I think they're going to want to have a voice. And maybe they all like Mishustin, but maybe they don't. Maybe they have somebody else in mind. So I think it would be very interesting. So in the soft coup, they're not going to execute him. They'll give him a happy retirement home. And if he's in bad health, I would be less worried about people going after him. Maybe I'm naive here. But they'd get him out of the way so they could set up the succession that they want. In a hard coup, they'd arrest them, which I don't think is that likely, or, they'd have to use force. Now, if he resisted the soft coup, then maybe you do have to get a little physical and get the right people. And then I'd wonder about how do you do that? Because Zolotov, the head of the Rosgvardia, he's a serious, serious hardliner. You'd have to work through something to get to Putin, to arrest him or remove him. Glenn, again, this is an area that you may have more insight than I do.
I definitely think, Peter, like Zolotov is not just a hardliner, but I think he's a hardcore loyalist to Putin.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't think he's a thinker like maybe some of the other people would be. I think he just does what the boss tells him to do. He's muscle, right? He's the weak. And I think that, yes, Putin created the Rosgvardia for a reason, because he was worried that some of the others, especially the FSB, was probably getting too powerful and he needed a counterweight. And the FSO can't be counted on.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, Larineco, and we'll get right back to the show. When I was in the Army and the agency, I was constantly chewing gum in the cockpit or on a long SDR just to help pass the time. Now, Glenn and I today are always ready to upgrade our routines, and we recently heard about Larineco, a chewing gum that actually makes your teeth stronger every time you use it. They sent us some gum, and it's as advertised. If I had known I could be chewing something that actually helped my teeth while passing the time, it would have blown my mind back then. Larineco is better for you chewing gum that uses the same mineral your teeth are made of to support daily enamel health. If you've seen the show, you've probably noticed Glenn sometimes chews some Larineco when we're on air. He's tried several flavors, he's liked each of them, and his wife is also a fan now. It's a totally effortless way to make sure you're taking the best care of your teeth possible. Right now, Larineco is offering our listeners up to 50% off at buylarine.com/restricted. That's buylarine.com/restricted for up to 50% off. And now, back to the show.
Yeah, I very much agree there. And that also tells you just how much Putin what a nest of vipers. You're in an environment where you have to think like this and worry about that. And you've got to create another security entity to ensure your protection. What a system.
Peter, when you talk about health, I mean, think about like mentally what that does to someone over time. When you're completely paranoid all the time and you're constantly trying to read everything, we have some of that experience because, in our jobs that, you're reading people, you're having to like read situations and, you do that for 25, 30 years. It's intense. But when it's life and death all the time and your vision of yourself and your empire depends on if you get betrayed it must be crippling in many ways.
I agree. It must be exhausting.
Exhausting.
I mean, it just, how do you do this? And then you have to worry. I mean, I've read stories. I don't know how accurate they are. I don't know that there's body doubles, but there's a lot of precautions about travel and logistics and which car is he in or not and things like that, which I think is plausible. And so in this third scenario, the one about internal coup, I thought a lot about this because if they're able to put together a coalition of people to remove him, most of these people were at that Security Council meeting on February 21st, 2022, which was televised naturally and by design. Putin wanted that televised. So every single one of those leaders in the Security Council was on record as saying, oh yeah, great, we have to do this. Smart politics there. So if any of those guys are involved, and I would think some of them would have to be, they're going to have to explain this problem away. So they would then have to focus on, it was the right idea, but the prosecution of this war and the management of this war really was where the problems began. And I'm sorry, but the person who's most responsible for that is Mr. Putin. And then interestingly, you can see the parallel I'm going at here is I use the phrase deputinization. it's a little bit like after Stalin. How are we going to explain some of these horrible things that happened? And Khrushchev obviously made political capital out of this, but that was a very bold and risky move. It was a shock to the system for a lot of members of the party. There was an anti-Khrushchev, an anti-party group attempted coup against Khrushchev in 57. And ultimately in 64, he was removed. So it's a high-risk game if you get into that. But I think in this case, in large part because of the impact of the war that you were alluding to earlier, Glenn, this war is so horrific. And the consequences, both in terms of the people, the families, the financial implications, the military implications, the shift in the budget priorities to the defense sector, it's huge. The sanctions, the fact you can't travel, you can't enjoy your newfound middle-class stature or wealthy stature to travel abroad. There are a lot of reasons this war has taken its toll on many Russians. So I could foresee a slow, gradual de-Putinization process if, in fact, there was a genuine internal coup where they removed him. And then they'll have to figure out how to manage that. That I don't think will be easy.
If he dies in office, do we end up seeing statues and streets named after Putin versus a hard coup where you might have de-Putinization, as you said?
I'll be interested in Glenn's thought on this, but my gut instinct is I don't think there would be this big glorification of Putin at this point, in large part because of the impact of the war.
Right, I agree.
We're seeing a little bit of that now. He's alive, and I have heard there are some statues, things are named after him, not to the degree of Stalin, not even close. But I don't know that he has the genuine popularity. And incidentally, that's another issue. You read about these public opinion polls that the Russian government has authored or contracted out. And the last one I saw, they were saying, "Oh my goodness, he's dropped 5 points to 66%." Well, I'm seeing other things from Russian experts who write in different journals, and they're saying, well, what I'm hearing from my sources is the numbers were in the 30s, but no one's ever going to admit it. And this is one of the great problems of doing analysis these days. I don't trust a whole lot about anything concerning Russian polls anymore, not in a long time. So the idea that there'd be a massive outpouring and grief, there'd be some. I'm sure there'll be a big funeral, and I'm sure there were people who benefited. And they like the fact that he brought Russia back as a great power, and they see all the positive things the way they saw perhaps with Stalin. But I don't know, Glenn, what do you think?
No, I'm with you, Peter. I mean, I think whatever contract he had with the Russian people in the late 90s, that they gave power to him so he could bring the country off its knees and bring order and prosperity, that ended in 2014. And it's been going backwards since. I think I would probably agree that if I was a Russian and somebody called me to do a poll, I would not say I'm like, I don't support President Putin, right? I mean, no, that's not a wise thing to do. So that those polls are not very accurate. And I think a lot of people are probably very frustrated. Earlier you mentioned like some of the people around him maybe have lost people. I think what they've really lost is they've lost money, they've lost prestige, and they've lost access. One of the things I know based on my conversations with Russians is that, including from that circle, they were frustrated even before 2022 that they couldn't travel like they used to, that they were pariahs, that, their allies were North Korea and Iran, where, in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, they were going to Italy, Spain, they were traveling to Europe, they were coming to the United States. That has gone away for the most part. And access for their children to study overseas has become harder. And of course, the world now sees Russians. I just wrote an article about this, but they did the World Cup in 2018. They spent millions of dollars to present Russia as a tourist spot for people, and it's all gone now. And Russians then were telling me, this is all about Putin's ego, number one. Number two, we invested all this money, our tax dollars, which is never going to come back to us, to build stadiums, roads, teach police officers 10 phrases in English, but we're going to do something stupid and it's all going to go away. And they did in 2022. Who now is saying, you know what? And maybe in 2010, people are saying, let's go to Russia on vacation. Let's see what it's like. I want to see the Hermitage. I want to see, the Kremlin armory, whatever. Now, I'm sure people are saying, yeah, I don't think I'm going to take a trip to, Ryan, any plans in the future that you and the family?
Oh, there. So disappointed. I hope one day I can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think he blew it.
Yeah. I'll avoid the issue about travel. I'd love to, I still would love the opportunity, but I know it's never going to happen in my lifetime.
Well, Let's go back to the stress on Putin too, and like the different threats. We shouldn't forget now too, he must be horrified that the idea that the Ukrainians were killing people on the streets of Moscow and military concerns, the fifth column factor. When you're setting and assassinating up a general in downtown Moscow, that means you have a network that helped you do that. That must be horrifying for him too, especially as a former intelligence officer, because he knows how it's done. They've done it to many people, and now their number one opponent is doing it back in spades to them, and that must be scary.
Glenn, I totally agree, and I have thought a lot about that. It's pretty amazing what's happened in the last, I guess, 6 months or so. The onslaught of these Ukrainian missiles and drones, and some of the strikes and the special ops, like the one, I guess, was it in Siberia, maybe a year and a half ago? Somehow they managed that op and took out an airfield and aircraft.
Spiderweb.
Strategic air.
Yeah.
How do you do that without insiders, as you say? There had to be collaborators. And then you have assassinations in Moscow proper. And now the kind of the regularity and concern ever since the strikes on the refineries, gas shortfalls, the fact that there are lines, which reminded me of the 70s here in the US, but people get upset when you can't get gasoline for your car.
Right.
But people are really feeling the direct impact of this war that they hadn't felt in the first 2 or 3 years. This is a big deal. And I think that feeds into this debate that we alluded to at the very beginning. Just how much pressure does Putin genuinely feel? And is it sufficient to cause him to decide, I need to somehow reach some way to cease the war, call it whatever you want to call it, a ceasefire or a halt. I don't know whether he'd go for a settlement, because I don't think he's changed his views on what the settlement has to include. He'd then admitting that I've made a big mistake.
Right.
But we could debate that point. I think he's still a very hard line on the must-haves he needs to show for this big decision.
But they seem to be only his must-haves, right? I mean, because he's said them so many. I mean, I know they're repeated by Lavrov and others, but it's really a line he's drawn. I'm sure he could make it look like a victory to anyone else, maybe except for himself in many ways.
Maybe. Well, if he has to have the entire Donbass. So I suppose you could say if we froze the line of contact at a certain place and it's 12% short of what I hoped, you can say, well, it's all it is a ceasefire. That's all it is. But we'll stop and say we still understand that this must be part of Mother Russia. We're not going to let people forget that. But for now, we're prepared to think long term, which is the Ukrainian argument. They're just going to buy time to rebuild and come back. So he would be playing into that narrative. I don't know. Is that a smart move, Glenn?
Well, I mean, just ask the Chechens, right? I mean, I say this all the time. The Ukrainians are not naive. They know that if there's ceasefire, they better have some very strong guarantees, or else they're going to face another aggression from Moscow as long as guys like Putin are running the country. And the chances are, in their experience, and I welcome your thoughts on this too, Peter, but historically, that's what you get running the country. There's no real history of democratic Western, or, I would say Western leading, or leaders that want to get along with their neighbors and that can accept. There's no Ataturk that I've ever seen in history, a leader that says, we don't need this big empire. We can just focus on building a healthy Russia. Let's get along with the Ukrainians and the Georgians and the Uzbeks. The desire is always there to rebuild, to reconquer. And I think there's motivations for that one. They're scared to death of everyone around them. They want buffer. They want resources. They want access to warm water ports, right? All that stuff. But there's also something psychological. They can't get over the fact that, they think that they own those are their spheres of influence, and they have a right to dictate to the people in those countries how they need to live, which always amazed me.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with you. I think there's a phrase I used to use a long time ago when talking about Russian foreign policy, or actually Soviet foreign policy, but then Russia, even under Yeltsin, was, their goal with their newly independent state neighbors was, they're independent and all that, but they have to understand that their foreign policies must be consonant with Russian security interests, i.e. no NATO. You need to know that, we're the big boy on the block here, and there's some things you just can't do. They're red lines. Apart from that, go be independent. That's fine. But they're, based on their past history, particularly Ukraine, as we saw in Georgia, there's a lot of them who decide, I'm independent and I don't want to be part of this game that you're playing, and I need to be able to protect myself. And generally that meant looking toward NATO.
Peter, you'd mentioned public opinion of Putin is probably not 62%. It's probably closer to 30, if that. The fourth scenario was massive revolt, uprising to bring down the regime. This, I I'm so excited to hear, like, what would this look like? What would it take? I've asked Glenn about this.
Well, I don't totally dismiss it, but I definitely am of the view that I think it's one of those low probability, high impact scenarios. I'd like to believe it. I really would. But because of the police state that we're living in, I mentioned Stalin in the 30s, but I mean, this is a country right now where you literally can't say Specjalная военная operation, this special military operation. Are you kidding? People rat each other out for this.
Yeah.
And now with this recent crackdown, they're increasingly intolerant of anybody even saying war. Like they're outlawing people who are running for office from the Yabloko party. They've cracked down on somebody who's an independent-minded person who says, I just want peace. You can't even say we want peace. It is genuinely a police state. Now, having said all that, if something really horrible happens, supposing the Ukrainians hit Pater with a bunch of missiles and they take out some sacred place, I don't know, the Hermitage, something near the Kremlin, and people are outraged and hate Ukraine, but at the same time they say, this war is killing us. Is there something that could trigger the people to say, we can't stand this regime and we have to do something about the regime? Then you have to get through the police and security, and it's hard to launch a revolution, I think, right now. But Glenn, you've talked about this. Tell me more.
Well, one, I think what the Ukrainians have been trying to do is increase the level of casualties to the point where Putin's going to have to go for full mobilization, which they probably assess is going to put pressure on him because people are going to be very, very dissatisfied in the big cities, especially St. Petersburg and Moscow. And for Putin and the people around him, the level of paranoia is beyond anything I think we can understand. There's not, you're talking about like a police state. There's no opposition. I think, this is one thing that they've been very effective at destroying the opposition by either co-opting members of the opposition or putting them into exile. Even the members of the opposition in exile are entrusted by many people because they have this long history. It goes back to Tsarist times, by the way, of recruiting and creating fake opposition parties, using them to draw off power from other opposition parties, politicians. So it's very hard to see, that, okay, we're going to have, by the way, important Duma elections in September, right? And everyone's watching that. But as you're saying, when some of the members of the opposition or different parties that are saying things that are not acceptable to Putin and his inner circle are just being arrested, disbarred, taken off the ballot. So I don't know. There's so much to unpack here, Peter, including, let's finish with the scenarios because there's some other things too. I know that you wrote a book about, being a CIA analyst, and I do want to talk about that a little bit because we don't tend to. I think you may be our first senior analyst that's been on the program. We've had some former operator case officers, we've had ambassadors, diplomats, some foreign officials, but it's great to have you here. And I do want to talk about your experience as an analyst looking at the Soviet Union and Russia and how all this isolation is going to impact our ability to understand Russia in the future and analysis of Russia.
Wow. Just a couple of starting points. I'm a huge fan of open source material. I grew up studying, Stalin and other leaders' speeches and reading, the leading newspapers and journals to look for those little clues that would give us some sense. The Adnaka clause, maybe there's a little bit of a difference here. There's some debate that we need to understand. I still think that's a valid tool. But the problem now is that you're inundated with so much information. You have to sift through a lot. I'm also a big fan of the importance of clandestine. You got to have humans. And SIGINT, obviously SIGINT. But I'm also mindful of, there are limitations in all the ints. And HUMINT, how do you know you're being misled by somebody? The case of Iraq is so much is written about that, but even the people on the inside didn't know. It was so compartmented, and then we thought we had good sources, and we didn't. And some of them were fabricators. Same thing on SIGINT. I always tell the story of, what do you believe when you get SIGINT? I use the anecdote about people with teenage kids. Your daughter tells you, I'm going to the library tonight with my friends. That's the conversation with the daughter and the mother. The next phone call is the call to her boyfriend. Whose house are we going to and who's bringing the beer? Okay, which is it? You got the words. I got the actual words. They're spun gold, but which is it? So, SIGINT has its challenges too. But I'm with you. When I think in a tightly bound country like this, getting access to without solid information and insight, I think is very, very hard.
And then just to add to that, Peter, having the expertise, the background understanding, you mentioned SIGINT. The Russians are infamous for misleading SIGINT, using double, what they call radio games. Famous Operation Monastir, the way they played the Germans, using complex counterintelligence operations to throw off both the SIGINT and the UMIT. They've run mass double agent operations to confuse their enemies. And so if you don't have strong analysts who understand that history and can see like a pattern forming that we saw maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago, this is what worries me all the time about the Russia issue, because you have to have people that's what they do, and they've grown up doing it, and they have that experience. And I just think it's hard today to do that, especially when there's a country which is so isolated. We don't have a big diplomatic presence anymore. The bilateral relationship is pretty much very, let's just say, fragile, and it's very hard. Like, I'm sure American aren't studying in Russia. Hopefully, Brian, you're not thinking about sending your sons to an immersion in St. Petersburg. That was happening for a while, and it was probably good. It's not there anymore. And then the only information you're getting is from outside sources who have a huge axe to grind with the Russians, which also makes it hard. Because you have to, there's a bias. We saw that during the Cold War. There was a strong bias from different communities. Even the Russian community in the U.S., like the white immigrant community, a lot of the stuff they said was tainted by their anger and their emotion. And you have that. And so going through us as an analyst today, it must be super challenging.
You make an interesting point when there's a former NIO who's deceased. Did you know George Colt?
I have never met him, but I've heard his name, yes.
Well, I remember this thinking as an analyst. So George had so many contacts in Russia. I mean, he would talk to academics and some politicians. Sometimes he'd call them on the phone. But he was always looking, I want to get word from the people who are in the system. And again, this is the late Soviet era, the late Gorbachev. Things are a lot more open, and in the early Yeltsin years. And then with the change in regime and the hardening of policy toward the U.S., they decided they weren't going to let George travel to the USSR anymore, or to Russia even anymore. So he was denied a visa. So what did George spend all his time doing? He would go to Georgia, Ukraine, the other independent states. So guess what perspective he was getting from all those people? It's exactly what you said. People with an axe to grind, or people who have such strong views because of their past history. It's going to be hard to get kind of clear, objective info, as it were, on the target country. So yeah, I think it's very hard. In terms of the workforce and the analysts, one of the things I enjoyed as a young analyst was when I got hired, it was like I died and went to heaven. I'm working in an office with literally hundreds of analysts who were all Soviet studies majors about the military, the economy, politics. But it was like going to a big university with all these people with pretty serious backgrounds in Russian studies. And I thought, holy cow, it doesn't get better than this. Of course, that shrank after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a much smaller office, obviously, later on. But I think it's very important to have people who understand the history, the culture, people like you, Glenn, who also have a deep background in literature, which provides a lot of insights into the culture and how people think. So I still value that as an important asset to have if you're going to come on board as an analyst. Now, the flip side of that is, you all know the story, the metaphor people use a lot is the hedgehogs and the foxes. Sometimes you get so deep and so expert, you become the deep expert on one big tree in the forest, and the fox is running around and says, oh my gosh, 3 miles away, there's a huge fire coming and it's going to destroy the entire forest, the Soviet Union. So are you so mired in all the minutiae and the details that you sometimes don't see the bigger picture? I don't think that's what happened in the case of the Soviet Union. I think we did a pretty good job on that, but that's still debated by some people. But I do remind myself, sometimes the deep experts aren't always the best experts to get perspective on.
I didn't get to experience the kind of segregation between the ops and analysis sides of the house. And I know you've written on this, Peter, kind of like the embedding of analysts within the mission centers and closer to ops and vice versa, and how powerful that could be. I think you kind of you bring that deep expertise with some of the other disciplines within the agency, and the field perspective seemed very powerful coming in. And that was all I knew for the agency at the time.
That's very interesting, right? That's still a pretty serious debate, even within the building. And I will have to be honest about it. I was an advocate. I thought it was a good idea to do the the change that John Brennan brought about in 2015, the integration of the directorates into these mission centers, if it's done correctly. And that's, I mean, I think like everything, it all matters. And how does the implementation work? Do I need to know every secret? Do I need to know a whole lot about all the aspects on the operations side? No, but it's helpful to have good contacts on the DO side who can tell you, well, this actually really is a very good source, or one maybe we're still working on that maybe didn't get that kind of insight before. But then there are others who say it's just a little too risky. Or then we get into the cultural issues of the various directorates. And I think the place where there was a challenge in putting together mission centers was personnel. Who's on your promotion panel?
Yeah.
Who's your real boss? Is it the D on the 7th floor, the director of operations, or the director of analysis, or is it the mission center chief and the deputy? And I mean, that was a scarring experience for some people. In some mission centers more than others. And I think we got through it okay, but we definitely had our challenges. And Glenn, I'm sure you know about this.
Yeah, it's a very complex topic. I would say, like, having led teams in CTC, which was kind of at the forefront of doing this, it was, I mean, amazing. In fact, I just had dinner last night with 3 of my analysts that worked for me when I worked in CTC. And, we had this great conversation, and I was laughing with them because, like, you talk about a cultural clash. I came back from being a COS in the field. And when I was working, I had, 90, 100 people, and probably 80, maybe 80% were analysts. It's a different culture. It was like they had so much deep expertise, and I was dropped into a problem set. And I would say, hey, like, we should do this. And one of them was one of my first meetings. There were 2 of the young analysts in my office with, I don't remember, I'm not going to say his name on the thing. Randy is his first name. Great guy. He was my deputy. And I said, we should try this. And one of the guys said, that's the dumbest idea in the world. And had, like, being a COS, you could see I started turning red and getting up at the table. Randy's like, sit down. He's like, this is the way we do things. It's a different culture. And I said, okay, I said to the analyst, well, okay, why is it so dumb? And he said, well, like, your predecessor and your predecessor before him tried it. It failed. Both times fell flat on his face. I was like, well, maybe you're right. That's a pretty dumb idea. Thank you for, like, saving us for going through it again. They had the expertise. I didn't have the expertise. They were willing to say, like, in the DO in those days, you wouldn't tell your COS, that's a dumb idea. And of course, like, being in stations, we had analysts out of stations. They were great officers. Most of them that I worked with, it was a huge value add.
Yeah.
So I think the way what you said, Peter, is like how it was done. There were some problems in the organization of it, and the people in the DO were very upset because they felt that the authorities were taken away. I would agree with that. The chain of command got very blurred. I led in the organization after, and it was very, very difficult to understand who you were reporting to. In a bureaucracy, That's not healthy. But the idea, in fact, I remember in the 90s, I think it was AF division that first moved. It was like a big deal because I was a young officer and I was doing some work in AF at the time, and they moved the analysts in with the DO people. And I remember, like, the chief of the division at the time, who was a great, great officer, said, look, this is like, work together. Like, and it was great. It was a great environment there. So anyway, look, very difficult topic, but let's go back to the scenarios that we talked about. Because one of the questions I have for you, Peter, what do you do? What do you advise the president and the administration if tomorrow Putin passes away, or there's one of these scenarios happens and we have a new leader, and we can go through, like, who it could be? Maybe it's Mishustin, or maybe it's Bortnikov. Let's say Bortnikov takes over. Do we engage? Do we continue to treat them like it's Putin 2.0? What is your advice? How do we deal with that?
Wow. That's a big policy question, which I've escaped my entire life. But now that I'm an independent academic on the outside, that's a great question. And my natural instinct in most cases like this is keep an open mind and engage. Don't play the whole, it's the same old guys, you're from the FSB, it's going to be Putin 2.0. No, I think you engage. Let's have a conversation. Let's see what you really think about things and find out the reality or the perception's right, or maybe this guy actually has a slightly different take. And there's some areas where maybe we can work or at least try to improve and set up channels of communication. I'm a big fan of, and you know much more about this than I, Glenn, but you absolutely need to have channels where you can exchange information, even when you're not getting along, as we did throughout the Soviet Union, we did this, and you had station chiefs who had counterparts. They would talk with their intelligence counterparts, or maybe somebody even more senior, based on a relationship they might have developed. But you got to engage, and you have to have channels where you can have trusted exchange of views and facts.
Right.
And you're not being, set up with a bunch of baloney.
Right.
You've played that role, so you're in a better place.
As you know, the Russians, they want to have that channel. One thing about the Russians I saw is they're very realistic. They understand what's at stake if it goes wrong between the U.S. and Russia. Despite all their bluffing and the attempts to deter Washington from doing things with threats of use of tactical nuclear weapons or strikes, or my experience was they don't want a war like that. Not even Putin wants it. As isolated as he is. And they always wanted to have an ability to communicate at some level. And it was often hard to get people what I saw in the US, it was hard to get people to understand like how that has to be managed, in my opinion. But, they always, as you said, even during the coldest days of the Cold War, they had back channels. They used journalists who were actually GRU officers. Most Americans don't know that the president of the United States and his brother were meeting with a GRU colonel.
Yeah.
Who was being used by Khrushchev to message the White House.
Yep.
So
can
I ask you another question, Peter? Because I have to take this opportunity. I've never done this before. I just thought about this, but you were there when Reagan was the president.
Yes.
And you were there. Like there was a big debate. Reagan, he bucked a lot of it goes back to your hedgehog and your fox scenario. Maybe my understanding is that Reagan ignored the expertise of people like Kissinger and Nixon, who were telling him certain things, and then a lot of his, the experts on the Soviet Union, and he engaged and he took a risk that kind of paid off. Do you remember those debates? Like, were you?
Oh, I sure do. Yes, and we had a lot of internal debates even after Gorbachev became Secretary General or General Secretary. After '85, let me back up though on Reagan. Reagan initially was a hardliner, the evil empire and all that. But I admire Reagan for being so much more open-minded. Once he met Gorbachev, and this gets to the point, you really need to meet your intermediaries, your counterparts, and began to sense there was something a little different about him, that he was willing to take a few more risks. And he freaked the entire policy-making apparatus when, the two of them got together and talked about the zero option on nuclear weapons. My God. And so people said, you got to rein this guy in. Are you crazy? But I think that was the real Reagan. He genuinely wanted to pursue this. And Gorbachev was in my view, much weaker position. He knew how bad things were in the Soviet Union. I frequently use the analogy. I don't have hard evidence for this, but I think after he became the head of the party, I think he suddenly got exposed to a lot more than he knew before. It's like sort of you get into the accountant's office and you see the books and you go, holy crap. We are so much worse off than I thought we were, and I got to fix this. And you have the war in Afghanistan and the economy. And the debate in the office, just one anecdote, and it really depended on what discipline you worked. A lot of the military analysts were still mired in the Soviet military culture analysis, and one of their key data points was, okay, Peter, if Gorbachev's such a reformer and they're making changes, why is the highest year of Soviet defense spending in 1987, 1988? Of all the years, it just kept going up and up. How do I answer that question? And I'm saying, well, he did say they're going to remove 500,000 troops from Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact zone. Or he's actually talking about they're going to have to leave Afghanistan. I mean, that tells me there's serious thinking here that they have to rethink their whole international position and foreign policy goals. And, we had long debates about this. And then finally, when the wall came down and Honecker was left holding the bag there, it got much easier to have this debate. But then there was a new debate toward the end of the Bush administration about Yeltsin versus Gorbachev. Because some analysts said, Gorbachev's in an increasingly weak position. In fact, his policies potentially are going to bring the whole thing down. And others said, Yeltsin, he may be a populist and he may be the agent of change here, but he's also got an alcohol problem and he's a little unpredictable. And is this the guy? Can we be talking to a potential successor when we already have a head of state, Gorbachev? So there were debates in the policy community about how to try to manage the Yeltsin issue. A lot's been written on this, of course, but it was a fascinating time to be an analyst, basically, to live through all this.
Wasn't there a little bit, too, an effort by Gorbachev to discredit Yeltsin? So there was disinformation being pumped in right? And it's something that then, as with my own assessment, I saw in the 90s with Zyuganov, they used Zhirinovsky and Zyuganov to scare people. One of the things I think with Prigozhin that the Kremlin was doing was using him to scare people that if you put too much pressure on Putin, this is what you're going to get. The organized crime hot dog seller who's running around Africa looking like the Pillsbury Doughboy, and so who's crazy. And I do think sometimes that worked. And I remember in the, when I started in the late 80s, this big debate about Yeltsin and Gorbachev. Remember, Yeltsin fell off the bridge in Moscow and he was drunk. Now, I know someone that was part of his security detail at the time, and he said he was actually thrown off the bridge by the KGB.
God, I had not heard that.
Yeah. And that they did it deliberately, and they had cameras there because they wanted it to look like, he was a drunk and he was unpredictable and couldn't be trusted by the Russian people, and definitely not by the White House or by, anybody in Bonn at the time or so. Yeah.
Well, this reminds me a little of the later Yeltsin years in the mid to late 90s when it became increasingly obvious this alcohol problem was so big. You remember the trip to Germany, and he literally got off the plane and began to lead the German orchestra. It was painful. And that's when we knew we really need to spend a lot more time looking at the inner circle and who's going to be the next prime minister. Because you worried that on any given day, he could fall really, really ill and die, or you could have the soft coup variant too, where people say, how can we tolerate this anymore?
Right. Yeah.
Peter, I cannot let you go without getting your take. Which of these scenarios is most plausible to you that you've run through?
Okay, I thought you would ask that. So let me share a couple of data points. Fortunately, there are some terrific political scientists who've done a lot of data on how dictators fall. So let me give you a couple of data points. So this is a study by Erica Franz and Andre Kendall Taylor in a journal article in 2014. And they said 10% of leaders were ousted by a popular revolt. 10%. They did a study of all the foreign leaders between 1950 and 2012. And in all the cases when there was a popular revolt or an uprising, only in 10% of the time was the guy ousted. So that's not a high percentage for the people on the revolution side here. But get this number, 65% of the dictators were forced out by a soft or hard coup. That's 2/3. So that was a striking data point for me. In the current circumstances. And then, now that only gets you 75%. I couldn't find in the article, I'm assuming the other 25% is somebody lost in an election, because some of these countries have managed elections and they don't get managed as well, or they died. So I need to find out more on the numbers and how they got the other 25%. But basically, the 2/3 number jumped out at me. And at this point, I'm not big on scenario one that he's not going to manage a succession. No way. The fourth one, a revolution, I think it's very low probability. It's the second and the third ones that intrigue me the most. And I think if this war continues, I'm very open to this soft coup thing that internally. And I hate to put percentages on all this, but I think with each passing month or another year or so, the odds get higher and higher. I remember at the beginning of the invasion in 2022, one of the faculty members at Columbia, who's a super expert on military theory and operations and history, he actually said, Peter, this war could easily go on for 4 or 5 years. And I was thinking, oh, really? Come on. This isn't going to last more than a year or two. And here we are. We're in year like 4.5. I just couldn't even imagine it. And yet we have a guy who's so hell-bent on getting everything he said he has to have, and he continues to do this at great cost.
I'll tell you, Peter, just Glenn and I sometimes talk about the poly markets, kind of prediction markets.
Yeah.
So at the end of 2026, so the end of this year, there's 12% odds that Putin will be out one way or another, which
wow,
I feel is too strong of odds, but that's what the money's on right now. And it's not a whole lot of volume, maybe a couple million on that line, right?
So that's low probability, right? Low probability, high impact. It'd be a big deal if he's out for whatever reason by the end of the year. I'd like to think that if that happens, whoever succeeds him, I don't know that everybody else shares this vision of greatness and that we have to recreate everything the way Putin does. This is clearly an obsession with him. And I'm sure, I don't know, Glenn, you've read the infamous long 20-page treatise on the historical unity of the Russians and Ukrainians.
Right.
When I read that, I was just so blown away. I said, there's no way he's not invading. Nobody writes that and says this country literally doesn't exist and they're us and not do something about it. But I don't know that they all share that view. Maybe Patrushev does. I don't know. And again, I don't have enough info to have good insight on this, but I find it hard to believe that they all share that view that we have to have all this.
I think there's a good chance that there are those people that don't share that view, but more likely there are people that share that view, but they realize they can't do it the way they've been trying to do it. And at a minimum, they're going to need a pause, and they're going to need an infusion of investment and money to get the economy going again, to rebuild, to rearm, and to get ready to do it, like try it again, which is, again, I think what the Ukrainians are really worried about, because there is a desire on many parts of many people in the US and Europe to get back in there. I hear this all the time from investors. When is Russia ready? When can we go?
Oh, yeah.
Right. And, that's going to be something, because I also think too, we talk sanctions all the time. What is the incentive? How do we reward good behavior? If they withdraw from somewhere, if they adhere to a ceasefire, what do we do to respond? It's going to be a really tough debate, because not only are you going to have people in Washington that are divided on this, but you're going to have allies that are pushing us hard, dismember Russia, do everything you can to undermine them, because they're a constant threat to us. And historically, there's reason for those allies to feel that way. So, and you're going to have other countries that are just waiting to get in and take their piece.
2 points. The foreign investment thing, I've always been very pessimistic. I can't imagine how anybody would want to invest a whole lot of anything in Russia, given the absence of rule of law and property rights. I get the big oil companies, somehow they manage to get money out, but anybody else, it's so risky, and it's caught up in the local politics, as we saw with Khodorkovsky, for example.
Right.
I need to share one other data point that I was shocked to find in that article. So again, this period 1950 to 2012, they looked at all the people who died in office, and only in one case of a death did this lead to a democratic shift in the regime. All the other cases, the regime remained intact. I'm thinking, holy cow. So if you do have this soft or internal coup, or even if he dies, the odds are really high that it's still going to be not necessarily as hardline or repressive, but it's going to be the same regime, the same inner core of people who are running the place.
Right. Wow.
That's a high number.
Right. That's a tough statistic. Yeah, I said just before we finish up, I do want to, again, you've written a book. It's going to be published by the Cipher Brief, and it's basically, we don't have a title yet, right? But it's being developed as we speak, honed, but it is about analysis in the CIA and the careers of career analysts, correct?
Yeah, I interviewed, with the permission of the agency in public affairs, I interviewed 30 currently employed analysts, not old-timers like me, but real ones who work there now, who were there for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and said, tell me about your career to the extent you can. Tell me what you did, what accounts you did. Did you travel much? Did you do anything overseas? And it's pretty amazing. In fact, I was very jealous at how much more they did in 5 years or 10 years than I ever did when I was a young analyst. And also the training. I'm a big fan of the career analyst program, the CAP program. It's like you're literally gone for almost 4 months when you EOD to learn what you want to know about doing analysis at the agency. So it was a lot of fun to meet all these young people, and I was happy to see, they're still young, enthusiastic, eager beaver people. Now these interviews were 2023, 2024. It's been a while for me to get this book out for a number of reasons, in terms of finding a good publisher. And Suzanne was very, very helpful to say, I really would like to put this out. And thank you, Glenn, for connecting me with her. I owe you a big one. So I'm excited about that. And if I can do a little self-promotion,
please.
This article on the succession process and so on, scenarios, hopefully that's going to come out by the end of the year in a journal. And where one whole issue of the journal is going to be Russia after Putin, assuming everything gets worked out and the editors agree and so on. So I think that's going to work. And I had done an article a couple of years ago in Foreign Affairs about Putin's war calculus and possible use of nukes and so on, which I still find a worrisome topic. I don't know that we're going to get into that now, but it's I do worry a little bit about bad scenarios for Russia where they contemplate the possibility, not that they would do it, but they would send out more little warning signals about you better be careful. This Putin has done in the past. It's a threat that may or may not be effective, but I like to think we're not going to hear that word a whole lot.
Right.
For a while.
Yeah.
Peter, I hope we can actually have you back on sometime. This has been fascinating. I want to throw a complex one at you just before we leave, like a real easy one on our way out. For these four scenarios, how, if at all, has the war in Iran changed your calculus on any of these four? Is it more likely, less likely, no impact with what could happen?
Yeah, that's another great question. I haven't thought about this too much, but at least as of right now, watching the Iranians and how hard over they are, it's kind of reinforcing my thought that Putin really isn't going to be ready to concede for a while yet. He's going to hang tough, and no matter what the cost. Now, I agree. I think you said it earlier, Glenn. I think a red line is this draft issue. If he actually tries to have another big draft call and it starts to affect a lot of the other Russians besides all the ones in the outer regions, then I think he's taking out a bigger risk, which would tell me he really is a little bit obsessed with having to win it on his terms. I just read something yesterday. They're trying to run up 30,000 North Koreans. Did you see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
So they clearly need the manpower. And if you look at the data from Institute for the Study of War, they're not making a lot of gain over the past 6 or 9 months. They're not gaining much territory. And with this drone war now changing really dramatically the nature of warfare here, I don't know how they're going to get the rest of this land, absent a huge loss in people continuing.
I don't want to get this number wrong, but this is according to a Russian analyst that I heard speaking. He's one of these, he's living in exile, but I think he's in Israel. But he claimed that by his calculations, for them to take all of Donbass by the end of this year, they would need another 90,000 troops. I think it was 90,000. And of that 90,000, the casualty rate would be over 60%.
Jeez.
Right?
That's just mind-boggling.
And so, yeah, we travel frequently to Ukraine. The Russians, in fact, the Ukrainians are taking territory back. So not huge swaths, but they are regaining some territory. The Russians are regaining some more territory, but very incrementally. The casualty rate is very high. The cost is very high. And again, I do think that he is very worried about having to go for full mobilization for a number of reasons. And the Ukrainians are trying to push him in that direction and as a means to force him to end the war. So we'll see. I don't, and it's a tragedy. The whole thing is a tragedy.
Oh, it's
unnecessary.
It's awful. It's terrible.
He didn't have to do this.
It's an interesting thing. I wonder to what extent the Ukrainians are now adopting a little bit of the Russian approach to trying to put more pressure, to the extent that the average Russian is now starting to feel the pain. And right now it's about wild berries or access to gas. The day-to-day living is really being affected. To my knowledge thus far, I don't think the Ukrainians are targeting civilian apartment buildings and so on the way the Russians have. But it is a means by which you're conveying a very powerful message that you need to end this war. And when you kill enough civilians, and I'm thinking that's part of the Russian strategy with this sort of multiple target focus of all these missiles on Kiev and other big cities. Are they trying to terrorize the population into putting pressure on Zelensky to say, whatever it costs, you just got to cut a deal?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's not what's backfiring. The Ukrainians, they're not putting pressure on him really to make a deal. Many Ukrainians say we're ready to make a deal, but not because of that. Mm-hmm. Right? It seems to backfire on the Russians. It amazes me, talk about analysis, how badly they understand Ukraine, how they miscalculated in 2022. So that's a whole nother podcast we could do and talk about like what went wrong on their side. But I do think like the strikes on wild berries and you talk about the gas. We have to remember like when I was a student in the Soviet Union in the 80s, like there were no cars on the street. I remember like it was like no traffic. Yeah. And then in the 90s, when they started like going to Germany, bringing cars from Europe, there were all kinds of schemes going on. Everybody had to have a car. And it used to remind me of the US where, if you didn't have a car when you were a young man, it was your identity. Like we had a car culture. And the Russians picked that up very quickly. So it's interesting, these gas lines, especially in places like Moscow or some of the cities, if you don't have a car, if you can't drive, I think it's going to impact socially. Like it's going to make people angry. You go back to like the 70s and the gas crisis, which I remember as a kid, people having to park in lines at gas stations, my uncle's complaining, So anyway, it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think overall, this has been a strategic failure for Putin. I wrote a long book chapter on this very issue that basically, where I would have given Stalin high marks or relatively high marks on foreign policy up until like 2021, even with all the fallout from 2014, but that overall he had strengthened their position with most regions of the world. But after this invasion and these costs, it's going to turn out to be his whole foreign policy is going to be a strategic defeat.
Right. Peter, we could talk with you for hours. I mean, this is great.
No, this has been great.
It's amazing. Definitely
For
have to
all
have
of
you.
our listeners from Bellport,
Yes.
I'm sure they're still on listening to this. There you go. Glenn's showing his hat for those who can only listen in right now. It's a beautiful yellow hat. Bellport. Peter, you said some very nice things about Glenn and myself before we hit record about the stuff that we did on the ops side and in the field and whatnot. But 40 years in the intelligence community that you did. Huge thanks to you. I hope we didn't bore you too much and you'll come back with us sometime.
No. Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and I knew I would have fun immediately because I know Graham, but it's a pleasure to meet you, Ryan. This really has been a real pleasure, so thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.